Hi, my name is Richard Dix, and this is How Did That Happen? A podcast where I look at everyday things or events and try to figure out how they came to be. Every week I will research one topic, and by the end of the episode, I hope to truly have the answer to the question, how did that happen? Hello, and welcome to another episode of How Did That Happen? This week, we are discussing bowling. Was it always in alleys, or did it used to be on the main street too? Come along for the ride this week as I ask, bowling, how did that happen? Bowling can be traced to about 7,000 years ago in the year 5200 BC in Egypt, and that's when the Egyptians they painted hieroglyphics in a royal tomb that depicted them bowling, and that's when they were able to date what they found back to that time. We even found a miniature bowling set in a child's tomb in Egypt, and it's not. If you look at the pictures, which they're out there, it doesn't look exactly like 10-pin bowling that you would see in a bowling alley, but it's essentially the same thing of, put some pins up and roll a ball towards it and see what happens. I mean, that was 7,000 years ago, and they already had that idea. The Romans had a game that was similar, but it was more akin to bocce ball than actual bowling. In 400 AD, Germany began using bowling as a ritual to cleanse oneself, which just sounds wild, I'll just say. They used rocks as bowling balls. In 1185, the Hospital of God's House was founded for religious pilgrims. It is located on the southern coast of Great Britain. On that property, there was a patch of grass by the hospital that had been reserved for the recreational use of the warden. It was called the Southampton Bowling Green. It was first used to bowl in 1299, and it is still in use today. Bowling was done on lawns at this point, and it would continue to be done so for centuries. In addition to lawns, in places like Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, different surfaces were used, like cinders or baked clay. In 1366, King Edward III banned bowling because it was distracting his soldiers from archery practice, which just, that bowling must have just been super interesting. In 1455, they put roofs over the lawn bowling, and in Germany, these roofed lawn bowling areas were called Kegelbahns and were sometimes attached to taverns or guest houses. And you really see, even when we get later on down into it, it's that the Germans really do kind of pioneer, and along with the Dutch, do kind of pioneer the American bowling movement when it finally does come over across the Atlantic. In 1511, King Henry VIII of England banned bowling for lower class people and made the lanes private so that only those who could pay could play, which is just another way to class people out and make it so rich people have something else they have that poor people don't. This was an interesting fact, but I guess I could put in I didn't know before, but I just thought it kind of went with this whole thing, was that even around this time, Martin Luther, the guy who the father of Protestantism, I guess you could say, he had a bowling alley attached to his house, or a bowling green, if you will, attached to his house, which I just read that and I was just like, I literally was like, wow. Like, I did not know that bowling got this deep. When English explorer Henry Hudson settled New Amsterdam, which would later become New York, in 1609, among the provisions brought with them were the equipment for lawn bowling. This is kind of what I was talking about how the Europeans would bring their love for bowling over to America, and that's kind of where the seeds of America's love for bowling were planted. In 1617, King James I of England created the Declaration of Sports, sometimes called the Book of Sports, which banned bowling on Sundays. So it seems like a lot of kings were really into controlling bowling. I would have never thought that. So I guess that's. I would have not in a million years. The book explained the types of sports that were allowed on Sundays. It should be said that back then the bowling was often grouped together with gambling. Like we said, it was attached to taverns sometimes, so I guess it could probably get a little, debaucherous. And it was viewed in a negative light in some circles. The Declaration allowed archery on Sundays, but only after the attendance of an Anglican service. And I wonder how they were able to keep track of that. Or like a head count in church, and then that guy can't play. He didn't show up. Like, how do you know? Like, I changed clothes. Like, how do you? It was devised as a way to get back at the Catholics who didn't go to church in their town, which is, it's really just another way to be petty, for people to be petty against each other. And it's kind of hard to explain. There's more information about it on this Wikipedia page that it's definitely going to explain it better than I am, because it started in a small town and eventually became national. But the small town, where they were just having trouble with the Catholics and the Protestants there, and them also trying to play games. It's a little ridiculous. Like I said, initially the Declaration was only for one town in England, but eventually it went national, and then it was reconfirmed in 1633 by King Charles I. Once again, so many kings who really, you would think they have so much more things to do than care about who and when people bowl. Let's see, the book as it should. The book was publicly burned in 1643, and from then on, you could bowl on Sundays in England. So if you go to England right now on a Sunday, there'll be people bowling. You can't yell at them because that law the book was burned 400 years ago. As stated, there has been bowling in New York since 1609. The oldest park in New York City is called Bowling Green. And when it was created in 1733, it originally had bowling greens, and it still stands today. There's pictures of it online. I was in New York a couple months ago and didn't even think to look over here, but it's in Manhattan, and you can see all these big buildings, and then there's just one little park, like one little itty bitty like circle, but it's interesting to know it's been there for 300 years. Let's see. There have been variations of how many bowling pins that were used from throughout this entire time. We talked about, like I said, originally with the Egyptians, it wasn't even. I mean, it was like I may post a picture on the Twitter account. Like, it's bowling in like the loosest sense of bowling. Like, it's, you know what I mean. You're not going to find at your local AMF, but like, so it changes the amount of pins people use. Eventually, the number was finalized to 10, and that started when the products were being made, were sent out as opposed to being constructed with whatever they could be found around the house. Before there was like one company, which we're about to talk about, people were just making this stuff at their house. And so how are you going to tell that guy he can't have his pins this amount of distance from his foul line and how many pins he wants to bowl with or whatever? But in 1880, the Brunswick Corporation, which up until that time had only made billiard materials, began making bowling balls and accessories. They even started to make and ship the wood that would create the bowling alley, like the actual alleys, that we know and love. They were initially installed in pubs, which explains the connection between drinking and bowling and why there is always a bar and a bowling alley. The first governing body in America was set up in 1895 in New York City. It was called the National Bowling Association, the NBA, and founded by local clubs that wanted to kind of come together. They standardized the amount of pins used at 10, as well as the ball size and distance between the foul line and the pins. This was originally a men's-only club, as most things were during that time, and the women were forced to make their own, called the Women's International Bowling Congress. I think it's interesting to note that when the women made theirs, the first time they made it international, and the men just kind of kept it national, just a distinction. So the International Bowling Congress would eventually merge with the American Bowling Congress in 2005, so it only took 110 years to create the United States Bowling Congress. The bowling balls used during this time were made out of lignum vitae, which is a Caribbean hardwood. But the balls have been made out of all types of different materials like rubber, polyester resin, and the more modern ones are made with a urethane shell. And I mean, that's an interesting thing if you have nothing to do, is to go on YouTube and watch how a bowling ball gets made. It'll take up 2 minutes of your time. Up until the late 19th century, some balls were made with only 2 holes, one for the thumb and one for one of the other 4 fingers. In 1905, England created the first English Bowling Association, and that same year, the first International Bowling Board was created. I guess they don't count the women's international couple. While some women bowled before the 20s, it was prohibition during that time that drove the bowling alleys out of saloons and bars and made them a more family-friendly activity. So we really probably have prohibition to thank for why, why basically bowling became a family activity. Because who knows, had that not have happened, bowling could have just been relegated to another kind of like just a drinking game, a bar drinking game that never got taken like in the mainstream. It's an interesting thing to think about. The prohibition could have been the reason really why bowling alleys are like as ubiquitous as like Applebee's. In 1950, the American Bowling Congress integrated their ranks, allowing membership from African Americans and other minorities. And this was done due to the pressure put upon them by MLB's integration a few years before. At this stage, it's interesting because at this time, professional bowlers and professional baseball players made about the same amount of money, and so that's why they kind of had to move in the same circles at that time. It's like, oh well, the MLB let Jackie Robinson in, and like so, but it's like now there's not much that would happen to where, oh, the bowlers are doing this, so the MLB better do that. But during that time, they were actually around equal as far as the amount of money they made. In 1959, competition began in the Pro Bowlers Association, which would become the authority on all things bowling. It began in Akron, Ohio. While bowling had been on television before the formation of this group, it was the PBA that spearheaded this endeavor and brought bowling to the big 3 TV networks in the early 60s. To this day, the PBA still remains the governing body of professional bowling. And that is how bowling happened. And now it's time for the roundup. And we're going to round it up. The Egyptians were bowling 7,000 years ago. The oldest known bowling green is at the Hospital of God's House in England, created in 1185. The Bowling Green eventually gets roofed and attached to taverns, creating a symbiotic relationship between bars and bowling that would last until the modern days. The Dutch and the German have a hand in making bowling popular in America due to their immigration and being big where they came from. Prohibition leads to bowling coming out of the bars and into more family-friendly establishments, and the PBA puts it on TV and makes it a household name starting in the 60s. Things I didn't know before. Okay, so some things that I didn't know before. First off, I didn't know bowling was so old at all. When I started this, I thought the history might go like 200 or 300 years. I did not know that. I did also not know that so many kings throughout history cared so much about bowling. It seems like such a mundane thing to give your time to, especially when most of those dudes were dealing with like wars and famines too. Or is it famines? Is it singular? I don't know. Dealing with that at the same time, but also, during that, they're just like, well, you can only bowl this way on Sunday, but don't die from this disease that everyone's dying from. And the early bowling balls were made of wood. I guess I didn't know what they were. I'd also just I don't know, bowling doesn't enter my brain too much throughout the week, but I never would have thought, that vitae, that whatever that was that I mispronounced earlier, that vitae. The nickname, another thing is and this is I did not know, and it's kind of ridiculous, but not that ridiculous. The nickname for the person, because all the bowling alley, most of them, the pin setting machines are automatic. They don't have hand. They're not done by people anymore. But the person who watches that machine and makes sure that the machine does its job is called the pin chaser, or in some circles, it's called the pin monkey. Which it's just like, where do they get this from? And this has been another episode of How Did That Happen? I want to say thank you for listening, especially the people who come back week to week and keep listening to me talk about how things happen. I appreciate it. The podcast is growing a little bit. I hear your feedback, and I'm working on it about the audio and all the stuff. I take it all in and keep it coming. I have no problem with that stuff, man. Just let me hear what you think. I'm your host, Richard Dix. Be sure to like, rate, and subscribe if you can, and I'll see you guys next week.